Hi, we're the Keepers of Nerddom. My name is Cody, and this is not Chris. This is
Jay.
Yeah, and so Jay is joining me today because we are talking about some stuff from World War II. And Chris will be back for some other things, some nerdy stuff, and these are just some subject matters that Chris isn't real keen on and doesn't know as much about, and so we had a special guest join us. And one of the things, first off, is just a very basic thing. If you enjoy vehicles, and specifically like tanks of World War II, I highly recommend getting something like this, or this little book is one of the most fantastic things that you could ever purchase. It's just very simple, eloquent, and it has like stats and figures for the vehicles. And this one, I actually like this one better even than this big boy. It doesn't necessarily have as much information in it, but it has vehicles listed by their nationality, and I believe in what is it? It's some sort of order, and I think it's more. Yeah, it's in the order of like when they showed up. So you've got Panzer I's before Panzer III's, and so on, and also like regardless of alphabetizing. Yeah. This book does that as far as them showing up earliest, but they don't separate it out by nationalities. So it's harder to find things that you want to look at in the same section. But at the same time, you're looking also in this one at vehicles that are happening at the exact same time. And so what they would actually come in conflict with each other. So we're talking about tanks of World War II. Jay, what is it about World War II vehicles that just floats your boat?
The fact that they were able to do it with not near as good technology as they do now, and it kind of started how tanks were made in the future. So, but the big difference from World War II to nowadays is all the tanks nowadays just about look the same with slight differences. World War II was the big testing grounds of tank warfare. So we've got tanks that are backwards. We've got tanks with multiple turrets. We've got just about anything with tanks. Right.
That's interesting because you're very right, because now we have the main battle tank is essentially their designation for everything now. And it is. They're very similar. Mm-hmm. The differences are cosmetic mostly, it seems like. And so World War II truly had the expression of experimentation. Mm-hmm. World War I had vehicles and tanks because you had the Mark I's through I think 7 for Britain, and the A7V for Germany. Is that the right designation for it? The big box essentially. Yep. And you know they're experiments, and without those, you know, and things like Little Willie before that, you wouldn't have had what we had in World War II. But World War II is when everything changed, and in those 5 years,
just about,
what you have is a progression from these little 37 millimeter guns and below to 88 to 100 plus, and armor thickness. The realization that sloped armor has such a different impact on how much armor you need and how much you actually have to have, and therefore the weight you can put on a vehicle. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. There's a lot we could talk about, and so we'll probably do another video because we could do just reviews of the vehicles as a whole. Mm-hmm. But I will say one of the things, and if you can hand me that pen, I'm going to write down a note before I forget. One of the things we'll talk about really just for this is our top 5 vehicles, because right now, you know, in World War II, we'll be specifically tanks. Okay, I think the closest other thing you could get into is like self-propelled guns, because oftentimes there were things that were used in that same role as a tank as well, or tank destroyers. We'll include those as some of our top stuff. What I will say is that the thing that's interesting too, one of the things, what was it? Is it Sweden, I think?
Maybe.
In modern times, they had in like the 70s, 80s, it was their main battle tank that didn't actually have a turret, so it looks like a tank destroyer. And it even had like this weird grill thing on the front to protect from things. And I've watched some videos on that thing. It's pretty funny.
It is an interesting thing.
So we will we'll talk through those. And at some points, I've got some miniatures from some of our games that we've played, but also some stats and figures of some of this stuff that I will actually be looking up through this little book as long as we have some information, because it's just fun to share. So Jaden, what is your number 5 vehicle?
Number 5. All right, my number 5 is the Panzer II.
Panzer II. You can hold it up there.
All right. Here's our little model for it. Panzer II was an interesting one. It wasn't a very good tank, But just the fact that it helped Germany take most of Europe in the early stages of World War II just is amazing.
Yeah.
And the fact that this is probably the first modern tank of World War II, because you look at some of the other countries' tanks and they were all massive, like Britain's TOG II, which I don't know if you've heard of that one, but it's big.
They have it in World of Tanks, and you see it occasionally, and you're like, why? Why is this a thing?
Yeah.
And it's very much a design from World War One. Because what is it? The Old Guard or the Old Gang is what that stands for.
Yep.
Panzer IIs, they were meant to be training tanks with Panzer Is to get ready for Panzer IIIs and IVs, my understanding. This one, it says, had a crew of 3, engine power of 140 horsepower, at least the Ausfitz F. But the interesting thing is, at least in the F, it had a 20 millimeter cannon, and the armor was anywhere from 5 millimeters to 35 millimeters. It's not a lot of armor.
No, it was not.
But it was, and really when you get into it, France had way better equipment.
Oh, yeah.
At the time than Germany. But Germany deployed their stuff much more effectively. And yeah, Panzer II is really, it's a fascinating vehicle. I started to notice, actually, whenever you play video games like World of Tanks, War Thunder, and things like that, you start to notice that there are certain design elements that, for most of a nationality, they have design cues. Not always, because sometimes they're giving different companies, like Porsche designed some of their stuff. Herschel, Crimp, I think. I can't remember some of the names for Germany, but they have different design things. But there's things like this where the Panzer II has this interesting, right below the turret, not quite a ring, but this shape where they have a flat front and then it angles off. And it's just interesting because a lot of their vehicles had that similar shape until they started doing like sloped armor things for like the Panther and such. It's just interesting to see that. And what's funny is Great Britain has a very interesting design choice of, they're designing for a different war a lot of times. Yeah. America likes to build their tanks tall.
Yes.
Very tall. And Russia likes to have, honestly, they have the best symmetry. Yeah. Ironically. And Germany, honestly, I find that they oftentimes like to build things not tall, but wider.
Yeah. Yeah, they do have wide tanks.
And it's interesting. It's fascinating that their design choices, and everybody was learning from each other. And my understanding is Christie suspension, when World War II broke out, was something that a lot of places were using and or copying and experimenting with. And so you see some of these elements show up in different countries. So I think Panzer II is an awesome one. My number 5 would have to be the BT7. BT7 is one of those that, if memory serves, it was Christie suspension, but it's also weird because you could take off the tracks. It could drive on its wheels on its own. Not that it really ever needed to. But it was crazy fast. It did not have very good armor. But what was interesting about it was that if you've ever seen, there's a quick little YouTube clip of the BT7 jumping into a lake. Just the fact that it could do it and survive and it didn't hurt it, it amazes me. But the simple fact is, it was fast, and that was the idea. It had a 45 millimeter gun on it, which is pretty impressive because this was before World War II, really. Yeah. And so it's pretty impressive, but the armor is where it's scary. It's only had 6 millimeters to 13 millimeters. So at most it had 0.51 inches of armor. It's not much. Yeah. But you get speed. The only problem is if you ever get tagged with a round, you're done. I mean, there's nothing protecting you.
I mean, that's just about how the Panzer II worked.
Yeah. And that's what's interesting. What's funny is the Panzer II had significantly more armor, at least in some parts, probably the front, than the BT7. Yeah. It's crazy. It does say here, though, its engine power is 500 horsepower. Wow. So the BT7 was going.
Yes,
I love it. I love it. And so it's not a good tank, but it gave ideas. Because there's something to be said for speed versus armor versus gun. And there's a balance to be had, but also sometimes if you have different vehicles in different roles, you don't need each vehicle to have all those things lined up. If the BT7 is super fast to get in and get out to report information, that's all it needs. But I don't know that it was always used like that, because at the time it would have been almost a main battle tank for them.
Yeah.
So, all right, what's number 4?
All right, number 4. We don't have a model for this one, but the Bob Simple.
And I have nothing in this book. Tell us about the Bob Simple.
The Bob Simple. Excuse me. So, World War II had started. Japan was taking over lots of islands, and they were getting really close to Australia. Well, there's one little country next to Australia, and that's New Zealand. Now, New Zealand relies on Australia and Britain for all of their supplies during World War II. Unfortunately, Britain was very busy fighting Germany, so they were well out of supplies. And Australia and New Zealand had to help themselves to make their own tanks. Australia did decent and made basically a Valentine, but for Australia.
The Sentinel, right?
Yep, the Sentinel. And Sentinel was pretty decent. Now, New Zealand didn't quite have the same amount of resources, so one man by the name of Bob Simple, I think that's his name.
I think it was his name.
Bob Simple. He decided to put it on his shoulders to create a tank. So what he did is he took a D8 Caterpillar and took a lot of metal and basically made a box around that D8 Caterpillar and added a lot of Lewis guns to it. Now, they were going to add the M3 M3 cannon. I don't remember what it's called exactly, but artillery. And they had 3 of them in New Zealand, a total of 3 of the M3s. So they couldn't afford to put those on the Bob Simple. So instead it had, I believe, 6 Lewis machine guns all around the tank. And that is just about how it worked. Unfortunately, this tank was never used in World War II, but it is still amazing to look at that.
There's 2 things that always make me laugh about the Bob Simple. One is, was New Zealand not invaded because Japan knew the Bob Simple existed?
Obviously.
And also the thing was, Bob Simple, people made fun of him for what he created, but some quote of his said essentially, I don't see anybody else doing anything about it. And like, that's true. When nobody else is addressing the problem, somebody needs to. And it is the most ridiculous, awesome looking thing you've ever seen in your life.
Yes, it is.
But he did something, whereas everybody else did not. So that's big. I like that one a lot. And it's the meme tank of World War II for sure.
Oh, yeah.
So number 4 for me is the Hetzer. This little guy. I just find it very interesting. At the time it was actually put into service was towards the tail end of the war when Germany's losing. So ironically, it's not actually a great vehicle to be in because of the time frame. However, the idea behind it is fascinating because it's taking is it a Czechoslovakian tank?
Yeah,
it's the LT-38, I think, was what it was.
I think so.
They called it the Panzer Kampfwagen 38T chassis when they took over, from what I remember. But they adjusted it to hold the 75 millimeter gun, and it's very limited mobility as far as where the gun can move, and essentially it has 8 millimeters to 60 millimeter armor, and most of that armor is in the front, right in the front. So if you hit it anywhere else, there's just nothing going to stop the round. But what's interesting is this thing was this little hunter. It's very small. It's very compact. When you get into the details, honestly, inside of it, it's ridiculously compact. And trying to load and fire and not just overheating this thing was ridiculous. And so it's got some challenges. But what's interesting is also some of the technology they said remote controlled machine gun on the top, which essentially was like stuff inside the tank that allow you to turn the machine gun and like pull the trigger somehow. But just the fact that they were that desperate to take an old chassis and turn it into a tank destroyer that actually was very effective, and especially in the shoot and scoot role, the idea of hiding somewhere because they were in defensive, so that way they could wait. And that's the one interesting thing is oftentimes people review like the Sherman as being defeated easily, and really, when you're in an offensive role versus defense, you can hide and you know where the hiding spots are, and the enemy doesn't necessarily. And when you've got the Hetzer with the same type of gun that the Sherman would have waiting for you, you've got an interesting problem. Yeah. And the Hetzers are just... I've just always, ever since I saw them, and read about them in this book, I was like, that is just one of the most interesting things, and honestly, it'd be one of the vehicles I would love to drive.
Yeah. Oh man.
Just to see.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
So it's a neat little gun or a tank destroyer that did its job well for what it could.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it was at a time when Germany was already losing.
Yeah.
So
luckily it was cheap, so they were able to make a lot of them.
That's something that always freaks me out when you read some of this stuff, and I think you've got one on your list as well, that the cost difference between making a vehicle that's a tank destroyer with a fixed gun versus a turreted, sometimes it's like 2 or 3 to 1 difference in cost.
Yeah.
So something about the turret and the casting or the welding or the molding or something, and that just took so much more time and effort.
I mean, I can see that because the turrets spun on their own. So
right,
and you don't need to buy that.
That's what's crazy to me. Like, just that's the thing that costs so much in a vehicle. So, what is your number 4?
Ironic enough, it's the predecessor to the Hetzer, the Stoog III.
There you go.
So it is a lot like the Hetzer. It was based off a Panzer III chassis, which hence the name Stoog III. And it had a 75mm short barrel gun, and that one did a lot.
Yeah.
Stoog III. It was used, I believe, I'm pretty sure it was used less than the Hetzer, but it had just about the same role, so we won't talk quite as much about it just because we went through most of the points.
It's interesting because it's got a similar gun on the G version. It doesn't have quite as much armor with the maximum of 50, but it's also a predecessor. But it's an interesting testament to the cheapness of what you could do with something that doesn't have a turret, and so you could save a lot of money and time. And so those are neat things. Stug 3s were all over the place. Stugs. How do you say it?
I call it Stug, but it's either or. I feel like Stoog is more of the professional version, and then Stug's like the casual version. That's how I think of it.
That's awesome. So as I get in my top 3, I'll just be honest. These are all almost tied for that first place in my heart, because the first one to me is the wonderful and beautiful KV-1. KV-1, very interesting because it came out along with the T34 series. Kind of, I don't know if they were exact same time frame, but
I think KV-1 came out a little bit before.
Did it? Okay,
yeah, I believe so.
So the interesting thing is, Germany invades Russia, not expecting much of anything, and all of a sudden they're facing KV-1s and a ridiculous butt ton of T-34s. And they are shocked because they were expecting, not this.
Yeah.
And what they find is something that is terrifyingly insane. And there is the KV-1. And what's interesting is it doesn't have a large gun, but it actually, at least this version in this book says 76mm. But what's interesting was the armor, because it had 25 to 75 millimeters, and later they even had it up to 130 millimeters. Yeah. So this tank, at the time when Russia's invaded, it's laughing off shots. And so the T-34s are the ones that are keeping Germany at bay, in the sense of they're faster, they're more mobile, they have a decent gun on them too, but their armor isn't the same, but they do have more sloped armor. Yeah. But KV-1 has it's just a beast. It's a heavy tank. And when I first saw it in this game, I always just was interested because the stats put it as, this is a tough boy. Yeah. And playing video games and seeing pictures of it and studying more about it, it was a tough boy. Yeah. And it was slow because it only had 600 horsepower, but the weight that was underneath that 600 horsepower is pretty large. And as the armor increased, then you're getting slower and slower too. And you have variants like the KV-2 where they just mounted a massive, was it like 120 millimeter gun, something like that?
I think so, yeah.
It's some massive silliness. Yeah, there it is. 152 millimeter howitzer on some of them. I love seeing the idea of heavy tanks that not necessarily what Germany goes into fully. Yeah. Because they run into the problem of they're so heavy they almost break themselves in the Tiger and Tiger 2 and other things. I mean, you get into their elephants and Tigers and mouse and things like that, and you're like, oh my goodness. But KV-1 is, I think, the perfect example of a heavy tank in World War II, especially early World War II. It's got good lines. I'm just saying. It's got good lines. It just has a good design look to it. So, anyway. Sorry, I could guess about KV-1 all day.
Who couldn't? It's a good tank.
It is. What's your number 2?
All right, my number 2, it's a bit of a weird one, but we got the Churchill. So, this one is a heavy tank just like the KV-2, but Russia made theirs a lot better than Britain. Britain was interesting with their tank design. They focused a lot on World War I with their tanks, and you can see that in the Churchill's length because, that is a long tank.
Yeah. So my understanding, and I'll be honest, I am very much against most of Great Britain stuff because it seemed like Great Britain was designing for a different war than anybody else.
Oh, yeah.
Like, they were in a weird mode. And the Churchill's, what's funny is it's designed to cross trenches. Mm-hmm. And it's definitely an infantry support type vehicle because it's slow.
Yeah.
And so that's... Go ahead. Sorry.
I believe it was 4 miles an hour.
Is it really?
I'm pretty sure that was its top speed.
So, okay.
And it couldn't reverse.
Let's see. According to the Mark IV, early marks of the Churchill, this one at least could go 24 kilometers an hour or 14 miles per hour.
Right.
So it could have some speed, but it's still, you get up any sort of hill, you're done.
Oh, yeah.
But the original, like the first of them only had 2-pounder guns, which is 40 millimeters. Yeah. And then later on they got up to the 75 millimeter type guns. Yep. And I think that's pretty interesting that they were able to upgun this thing, which is good. The track system, really, I mean, ironically, the tracks actually protect the tank in many ways.
Oh, yeah.
And so it gives more armor. The original ones had 16 to 102 millimeters of armor, and later even had up to 152.
Yeah.
And it's a very heavy tank. Mm-hmm. And I just say that because I look at Great Britain, they had things like the Valentine and the Matilda.
Yeah, the
Matilda II, I should say.
Yeah.
And they were designed for something, it's funny, like, Great Britain had these wide gaps in their design.
Oh, yeah.
And some of the other countries did too. But they had heavy tanks with ridiculously heavy armor very quickly, like Matilda II. And I don't remember when Churchill first came on the scene exactly, but...
I don't quite remember.
Yeah, and Valentine even, from what I understand, had decent armor. But what's weird was then they had cavalry tanks.
Yeah, like the Crusader.
Yeah. Crusaders, the Covenanters, eventually you gotta get into the Cromwells too, and then you start getting the actual effective vehicles.
Yep. Cromwell's decent.
Yeah, I like the Cromwell, actually. That's one of the few. But it's funny, like Russia realized the BT7 didn't work because of the low armor as far as the main fighting vehicle, but Great Britain was just like, let's put more! Mm-hmm. And they didn't stop. And it's so weird that they didn't realize that. And so it felt like everybody else was learning lessons, and Great Britain was just going, nah, it's fine.
Yeah.
And they did learn lessons, but then they would learn the lesson, make something new, and it would be just as bad.
Yeah.
It's just strange. And so the Churchill is one of those few that they made something that was effective. And Matilda II, I think, is another one of those that's effective. Man, I wish this game actually had a Matilda II.
Yeah.
I'm sad it doesn't. Need a 3D print one.
3D print one?
That'd be pretty cool.
I know a guy.
Actually, yeah, that'd be really fun. Might have to do that.
All right.
So, number 2 for me. Is there anything else in the Crocodile, by the way? Or Churchill?
Oh, man. Churchill Crocodile. That's something else. That is a scary tank.
It is.
And then you had the Black Prince. Those were cool. Terrifying. But no, I'd say that's about it for the Churchill.
Okay. So my number 2 is this piece of glory. The first time I ever laid eyes on it, I fell in love. Not because it's good, but because of the idea behind it. It is a land ship. It's the T35 Russian parade tank, essentially. Because this was pre-World War II, actually, this thing came out. Yep. And it's not good. It's terrible. But the problem was, people saw this not knowing what it was. And you look at this, and in between the wars, they had this really big idea of, you know what? We need to have vehicles that... I'm going to find a picture of it, dadgummit. We need to have vehicles that can fight...
Multiple tanks.
And they had this design feature in between the wars of multiple turrets.
Mm-hmm.
The unfortunate thing is multiple turrets apparently cause your aim to be terrible. And so you can't fire them all at once.
Yeah.
And that T35 even had a problem of if it was turned just certain ways, you couldn't actually escape from certain hatches, some of the turrets. But this thing was shown off in parades in Stalingrad, in Moscow, sorry. Stalingrad. But it freaked everybody out because all of a sudden they see this monster, this thing that, how do you fight that? And what's funny is they did actually get used in World War II, but over half of them in their first big engagement broke down before they even got there. And then what's really crazy is one got captured by Germany, shipped back to Germany for their museum.
Yep.
And when Berlin was being attacked, it got brought out and either drove on its own accord or just dragged out in front to block a road.
Yeah.
And so its last true action was to block entrance from its own nation. But what's interesting, it had, the main gun was a 76 millimeter howitzer, and it had smaller ones as well, but it only had 11 to 30 millimeters of armor. Yeah. So just, it didn't have the capability of keeping anything out. But the idea behind it actually was very effective of scaring everyone. Yeah. That the Soviet Union was in charge, not you. But this thing was in itself actually ineffective. A joke.
Yeah.
But it put the fear factor.
Yes, it did.
So, what's your last one? What's your top?
It's a little cliche, but the M4 Sherman. And I love the Sherman not for its production, but for its modular capability. This thing could turn into just about anything. It could turn into a support vehicle. It could turn into a tank hunter. They even made it float.
Yeah. Well, and that's the one thing that, whereas Great Britain was experimenting and very slow and disjointed in their production, the U.S. did something that was bizarre from everyone else in many ways. They stuck with the thing. And really, my understanding is it came down to, because they had to ship stuff over, they couldn't just change things on a whim like everybody else. Great Britain had to ship stuff over too, but it was all of a few miles, you know what I'm saying, compared to what we had. And so the U.S. went, it has to stay, it has to work. And so their process for approval was much more stringent.
It was insane.
And so everyone else has got, massive amounts of trials and errors, and, Hitler's over here creating things that, just experiments and stuff that you shouldn't, because it's wasting time, resources, and money. And the U.S. is going, we're going to stick with the M4, but we're going to learn how to adapt it for what it needs. And it had armor-wise 25 to 51 millimeters, at least the early versions, and later on up to 63.5.
And it was sloped, so
it
helps it too.
It was sloped, and it had 75 millimeter gun, and later the 76.
Yep.
It is a neat vehicle in the sense that it did its job.
Oh yeah.
It matches up with the T-34, the Panzer IV, as far as a main primary vehicle that's going to fight your war. What's interesting is it has this interesting reputation of either not being effective or very good.
Yeah.
And the irony is, it was all of that.
Yeah.
Because they were slow in the change, it wasn't always necessarily up to snuff to fight a Tiger. Yeah. But at the same time, when you have 5-to-1 odds on purpose, because they always went out in platoons, I believe, of 5.
Yeah.
They're going to succeed. You may not be able to penetrate the frontal armor, but you can penetrate the sides of the rear.
Even then, if they were close enough, their 75s could penetrate a Tiger's front. That's one sad thing. Like Fury.
I need to see that movie still.
That tank battle's rough. They overpower the Tiger a lot.
Yeah,
so
I've seen a bit of that clip, and I need to watch it, and I haven't for some reason. I don't know why.
It's a good one.
So Sherman it's a good one. My next one, and my top is my namesake, because my middle name is Lee, is the M3 Lee. This was the closest thing that the U.S. had to a main battle tank until the Sherman was finally ready. And essentially they had the gun ready for the Sherman, but they didn't have the ability to get it into a turret just yet. And so the little one, I think it's a 37 millimeter on the top, was actually its main. It's actually technically its main gun, because the irony of U.S. like to build their tanks tall, but even then, when you're trying to come up over a ridge to fire, this 75 millimeter gun in the hull can't see things as easily. And the first time I saw it, I thought, man, that is an ugly little sucker. But the more I realized it's actually a very, very important step in their design process that they're going to do anything. And here comes my daughter, and she's going to be crying. What's the matter, baby? No. Oh, baby, it's okay here. Love you. Okay. All right. Just got to take care of her.
Oh, yeah.
So, the M3 Lee is a placeholder. It's tall. It's ugly. It's not great, but it's the stepping stone into the Sherman. And to me, it always struck me as one of the most interesting things that they could do, because at first the U.S. is selling vehicles to everywhere, and so they're selling these to Great Britain and Russia, and as well as Stuarts and other things. And so this vehicle went all over the place, and I just find it really interesting when you are that desperate to at least get something out on the field, and you go, this does work, we'll send you this. Yeah. And it does. It does the job, but not well. And the other thing is, if you look at it even in this miniature, there's a lot of rivets even on the miniature. And what's wrong with rivets?
Oh, man. So basically, the big problem with rivets is if your tank gets hit, those rivets will probably shoot out. So then that's just extra shrapnel your crew gets to take in. That was a big problem with the rivets. Yeah. So that's why most countries used welding.
Yep. And so it's one of those things that it was just an attempt to make sure that they had something for their allies to have. And it at most had 57 millimeters of armor. And, that's more than the original Shermans did in places, which is interesting, by 6 millimeters.
Yeah.
So it's just one of those things that it's early. It does work. It's not great. But I love, honestly, that the few times where you actually see vehicles that have more than one gun, other than just machine gun stuff, then it's useful in some capacity. I will say playing something like that in World of Tanks is challenging, because you get seen. Yeah. They can see you, because they can see 20 feet tall you. Yeah. So it's an interesting vehicle.
Yes, it is.
I think the last thing is there a bottom tank in World War II that you just go, oh my goodness?
The Valentine Archer.
Why the Valentine Archer?
Because that is, in my opinion, one of the ugliest tanks ever created. And the fact that they tried basically making a Hetzer with their Valentines, and it ended up putting the main gun on backwards, so their drivers literally had to drive backwards. Yeah. It's just...
I mean, it's kind of funny, because it's like the ultimate shoot and scoot, because you're not even facing the right way. Yeah. You're just go now. We fire, we run.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's a funny one. I remember when I first pulled that in this game, and I was like, what in the world is that? And at first I was disappointed, and then I realized, at least in the game, they're effective. They had a big gun.
Yeah, it's a good gun, but...
Whew. But they're goofy. Yes, they're a goofy thing. So I'd actually say my bottom, and understand this isn't because it's a bad vehicle. It's actually, for me, the Sherman. Only because, to me, it's in the same vein of the T-34 and the Panzer IV. Not that they're bad, not that they're ineffective at all. I enjoy the things that are more unique. Yeah. Like KV-1s, they still had a lot of them made. But the T-34 was the one that was the primary, and eventually T-34-85 with the bigger gun. And it's just, I enjoy finding these things that either they weren't effective, or they served their role and then they were done. Like T-35, it served the role of putting fear in people. But in itself, as an actual tank, it wasn't good. Mm-hmm. But it's unique because it changed and shifted how people approached vehicles and what they were scared of. Yeah. KV-1 changed the face of war whenever Hitler's getting reports of, our anti-tank guns can't penetrate this boy. We need bigger guns. Yeah. And stuff like that. The Hetzer is interesting. The Churchill is an interesting thing. So Sherman is an interesting one. And I say that the one Sherman I really enjoy, other than maybe the Calliope, it's always fun with the rockets on top. Cool. So variants are kind of fun, but the Sherman Firefly, it's the most interesting thing because Great Britain has an interesting struggle with figuring out their vehicles at times because they're either too slow or they're too heavy or too little armor. Yeah. They just never kind of get a good balance where the Sherman does have somewhat of a balance, but not necessarily great armor, but they have slope. But then the Great Britain finally gets a hold of some Shermans. They go, what if we put a 17-pounder, which is close to like a 76 millimeter gun on it, on this sucker? And they do. And they have to change the turret a bit because the gun's so big. And it's not as accurate, from my understanding, as a 75 millimeter at the time, but they make it effective. Yeah. And it's really cool. And so Great Britain took a U.S. vehicle and made it better. And it's like, well, it was one of their more interesting and terrifying vehicles that they had at points at that time. You know, because you get to the end of the war, they had things like, was it the Centurion at the very end?
Oh, the Centurion was.
Yeah. Because that influenced stuff for years to come, but it came off the assembly line right as the war was ending.
Yeah, 1945.
So, yeah, it's not that I hate the Sherman overall, but I'm not always a fan of things that are just mass-produced and the only thing, but the variants are where the Sherman gets really interesting, and that's what you said. I think that's interesting, too, because it has every role. Yeah. Minesweeper even, and
Sherman Crab,
flamethrowers. You have howitzers. And then eventually like the Easy 8 variants and things like that were much heavier.
Tank hunters.
Yeah. It's cool. So, last thoughts. World War II vehicles.
They definitely have their own place in history because they are the tanks that influenced everything. And you can see that just looking at the design of tanks. You can see which ones were more successful throughout the war. And you can see how those influenced modern tanks.
Yeah. It's very true. That is exactly why I love World War II tank history, because it does. You're absolutely right. It shaped what we know now. Mm-hmm. And, not all the technology was there that we have now, but so much of the understanding of what makes a good vehicle came from then. And that's the simple truth is, even then, one of the things that always struck me was whenever a tank would be disabled or destroyed, typically the crew, if they were still alive, they would burn it or blow it up from the inside. So that way, if anybody got a hold of it from the enemy nation, they couldn't study it. Yeah. And so there's a few times whenever they didn't. And so you would finally get a version of the vehicle and be able to take it home to study it. But that would also give you more access to, well, how are they doing their suspension or their firing mechanisms or their driving mechanics or their engine, and you could study that for future. And what's sad but true is war, unless everything gets nuked off the face of the earth, war makes technology go faster. Yeah. Because before World War II, I mean, tanks were slowly becoming a thing, but in those 5 years, 5.5, right? It escalates really fast. Yeah. And so this changed. I mean, just the fact that you go from a Panzer I and II to the Panther and the Tiger II at the end of the war. Yeah. That should tell you just what they're capable of. That they start ramping up this idea of bigger guns, more powerful armor, just more effective engines. I mean, that's the truth too. Like just the simple study of what engine stuff happened and changed during that time. Yeah. And that probably would have been 20 years or more. Normally would be my guess, and here we have in 5 years or less you've got engine updates that nobody would have thought possible. And so oftentimes war does speed up technology, but then once that gets into the private sector, then it speeds up again in a different way, because then they learn how to simplify it and shrink it. So it's interesting that war has that impact, and then after it gets in the hands of civilians, then things, not necessarily tanks getting in the hands of civilians. That's another problem. But so anyway, we have been the Keepers of Nerddom. I'm Cody, and this is Jay. Thank you guys for hanging out with us, and I hope you enjoyed getting to talk a little bit about World War II vehicles. Take care.